Critics of the Green New Deal say that it's just a dream, that there are no real plans to back it up. But last weekend in Philly, 1,400 people attended a conference called Designing a Green New Deal to talk about the radical changes the climate crisis demands and how to make sure that they're implemented equitably. Well, after the conference, we caught up with one of the speakers, Mary Annaïse Heglar. Here's our interview. I am here today with my guest, Mary Annaïse Heglar, who is a climate justice essayist, a writer, maybe the best person to follow on Twitter, a bat enthusiast, amongst many other things. Thanks for being here, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's so crazy to meet you in person after all of this internet time.
I'm extremely awkward in person, so prepare yourself for that.
So you spoke yesterday at this conference about the need to sort of pick up a new narrative for the climate crisis, to lift up different kinds of narratives, to tell the whole story of the climate crisis. Where do you think that the sort of environmental narrative is at right now, and what do we need to change about it?
For one thing, I think it's hyper-rational, and climate change is a really emotional story. It's a story of loss, it's a story of grief, and when you open up something that says like, you read about this thing, but you read about it through a hyper-scientific argument of percentages and gigatons. It's really difficult to empathize with it, and when you can't empathize with something, you can't really care about it. So we need to change that. It's hyper masculine language, is pretty patriarchal, and we also don't get to the full roots of the story. We start the story with the fossil fuel industry, and at best we'll go back to the Industrial Revolution, but we don't talk about the things that led to the Industrial Revolution, which are
slavery.
Yeah, exactly, slavery, colonialism, and all of those things. And when you look at it through that lens, you can't not connect it to all of these other movements that people are already energized about, like Black Lives Matter and the fight for reproductive rights and the fight for indigenous rights, right? So you could tap into momentum that's already there. And you could bring the people to the movement who are the most affected by it and who know how to organize, right? Like Black folks in the South absolutely know how to, Black folks all over the country know how to organize, and people of color all over the country already know how to organize, and they know how to go to the mattresses, they know how to fight for things that they believe in. So it doesn't make sense not to tell the whole story. Like it does it a disservice, right? And trying to depoliticize it and trying to just make it all about facts, it hasn't worked. Right? So there's empirical evidence in the side of it's just not effective.
How do you tell the whole story when this is something that impacts sort of every facet of human life, though? I mean, in order to tell the whole story of climate change, you couldn't leave out really a single person. You'd have to, as you said, start back at, the roots of not just the fossil fuel industry, but the roots of racism, the roots of exploitation and extractive industries. Where do you even begin with a story like that to really get into all of it?
Yeah, I think we make a mistake when we say putting climate into context. I think climate is the context. I think that's literally what the word climate means. There's a wonderful book by Amitav Ghosh called The Great Derangement, where he talks about if someone were to pick up our literature, our movies, our art of today, they would be like, where's climate change? Like, how is it not there? And that's because climate should be part of every single story. Is the setting, right? Like you couldn't write a novel without describing the setting. You couldn't just not describe what did it look like? What were the trees? What did the air feel like? And right now that feels like climate change. So we need to complete the stories that we already have. I remember somebody was talking on Twitter about how do we make a show about climate change? I'm like, I think you just include climate change in the shows that are already there, right? Like if I rebooted Northern Exposure and there was nothing in there about the melting ice caps, then I'm just telling a lie, right?
It's true. It's interesting. Even among so many folks who talk about silo busting and having to, take the climate movement to every other sort of movement, there's not really a lot of conversation about how to do that in narrative fiction or even, nonfiction and in writing about the climate crisis. And I think part of the reason that people feel so seen in your work is that you're really honest about this is also fucking terrifying, and I'm sad and I'm angry and I'm scared.
Yeah.
How do you not get paralyzed in that moment? I mean, it's it's so much to take in, and the stakes could not possibly be higher. How do you not just look at that and think okay, I'm going to throw up my hands?
I've definitely been there. And I would be lying if I said I didn't cycle back through that. But anger is a gift. Anger, I feel, is mobilizing, and so is fear. The biggest thing that pulled me out of like a pretty big paralysis was finding other people who were already engaged, right? And so, I hear people talk about we need to have a narrative of hope, and like I don't think hope is what brings people to action. I think hope is what you get after you become active. You have to earn your hope, basically, and you can't. If you feel hopeful because somebody else is doing something, then you're stealing someone else's hope, and that's just not fair. And I hear that a lot when it comes to the kids who are striking. And it's like, you're gonna steal hope from a kid? Dude, that's like not fair at all. Children are not
more extractive industries.
Right. Children they can be inspirational, but it's not their job. Children are to be protected. And so if you see a child, taking action, you shouldn't feel like that's cute and that's okay. You should feel a dereliction of duty as an adult, that you should be out there protecting that child. So yeah, I feel a sense of duty to try to break through my paralysis, but I also try to be kind to myself when I do feel overwhelmed and when I do feel paralyzed, because I'm human and I get to do that.
You wrote in, I think, your most recent piece, Home Was Always Worth It, a bit about, how you cannot use that to throw up your hands, also because the stakes are so high and there are so many people on the line, like lives on the line. You've been pretty critical of denialists and folks who sort of, don't seem to realize that even these, what we think of as like smaller incremental changes can have huge consequences for people, just not usually like the white dudes sitting by themselves in an office or whatever who are writing about this.
Yeah. I think, my problem with the denialists, the guys who, usually guys, right, who feel like there's no saving anything, there's no point anymore, is that, if you were going to get engaged to fight for a perfect world, you were fighting for a mirage. You were fighting for a lie, because the world has never been perfect. And so this idea of like, well, if it can't be perfect, then I don't want it, is just the most privileged, immature idea I have ever heard of. And I honestly feel a lot of sympathy for these guys, because I think they're in a lot of pain and they're too crippled by both climate despair and toxic masculinity to process it. Because they don't know how to deal with emotions, they tell themselves that their feelings are reality and that their feelings are facts. And they go to an extreme of just like, well, just throw up our hands and give up. And it's like, that is the punkest move.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I think I get frustrated sometimes when people, especially white guys, I guess maybe obviously, talk about climate change in ways that don't include emotions. And folks will say sometimes that, speaking emotionally about something this serious is a sign of weakness and we shouldn't do it. I assume that you've encountered that too. How do you respond to that kind of thing? Is that something that you've, come across?
I come into contact with it all the time. And I see that as emotional immaturity. I see that as fear of emotions, and that is a weakness to me, right? Like if you think that I see my emotional intelligence as quite a strength, and through my writing, I try to weaponize it and encourage other people to weaponize it and embrace. I don't think that traumatized people can heal things because they're too wounded themselves. And I think that once you face climate change, or if you're even thinking about facing climate change, you need to this is an emotional thing that you're dealing with. It's not scientific, it's not clinical. And you need to get real about how to heal those emotions, or process those emotions and weaponize those emotions and put them to work. And I think hyper-rationalization is what led us here, right? Like there was all the eugenics that went into justifying slavery. Like science can be weaponized into all sorts of things. So can hyper-rationalization, right? I think to practice science responsibly, you need to be emotionally intelligent. Same with policy, same with any other field. I think to be a good writer, you need to have emotional intelligence. You need to have empathy. So it's something we need to start embracing. And that's why I'm excited to see, millennials and Gen Z take more of a reign with this, because we have so much emotional intelligence. We're so much more emotionally intelligent than my wonderful Gen X friends all over the world.
So how do you, I guess, like build a movement and a narrative and a story essentially that has room for every kind of person? And how do you bring people on board? Because right now, frankly, like as we've both, I think, said, the environmental movement has a really racist history to grapple with, hasn't been super inclusive.
Yeah.
The climate movement uses language, I think, that sort of excludes people by virtue of being so jargony and based on expertise.
Yeah.
So how do you then kind of open that up to bring in people who might, on the one hand, hear that and think, I don't even know what those folks are talking about. But then on the other hand, hear someone say, oh, they're just trying to take your hamburgers or whatever, and think, well, that's the easy thing to latch on to. So
yeah, I think there's a lot of easy things to latch on to when it comes to advocating for climate action, right? Like climate change is terrifying. It is outrageous. It is overwhelming. But one thing is complicated. There is nothing complicated about this. I think one of the first things we need to do is we talk about climate, fight climate change as if you're literally fighting the climate, like you're fighting the air, which is not what it is. You're fighting the fossil fuel industry. And once you name the bad actor, once you name the villain in the story, it becomes a lot more simple, right? Like I think about, I may be misremembering the story, but Beowulf, remember that? Like I hated that book, but at first they think they're fighting something, like they're scared of something, but they don't really know what it is. And once they figure out what it is, it's like, oh, now we know what to do. And I think that's kind of the same situation that we're in right now. Once you explain to people that this is an injustice, that someone did this to you, it becomes a lot easier to get engaged. And I think the fact that we don't do that as much allows the, Fox News folks to just make something up and tell you that AOC is a hamburglar, which is the most absurd thing.
The ultimate trigger sculpture, kind of culinary sculpture. It has everything the Democrats hate: steak, plastic straws, and light bulbs. And if I could have put an SUV on this, I would have.
Yeah, this is, I think, something that you're known for is, calling out the enemy, being really explicit about who's to blame for not only the climate crisis, but also just all of the horrors of these extractive industries and, with the histories of colonialism and slavery and all of that behind them as well. And how do you think that really shifts the conversation? And what does it mean to build a common enemy like that? What do you think that it does in a room of people when you call out an enemy like the fossil fuel industry and move away from that sort of individual responsibility kind of narrative?
I think it's unifying. And I think it's freeing because you stop blaming yourself, right? I think when I look at the way people talk about climate in the environmental movement, it's pretty clear that it's being led by a group of people who have never been bullied before, right? Because I watch them and I'm like, stop hitting yourself. You know what I mean? Did you not have an older brother that would tell you were hitting yourself when in fact it was him, right? So they just sort of acquiesce and I don't know, kind of roll over a little bit too much. So you need to name names and be like, no, I'm not doing this to myself. I'm not committing suicide. You're committing genocide and you're blaming me for it. And it's bad enough that we've all been born into this system that is, that we've sort of become, because we operate in society. You could say that we're complicit in the crime, but to also make us complicit in the cover-up, to cover the tracks for our own murder, that is insult to injury, quite literally.